Welcome back to another Explainer. I'm so thrilled you're joining us today because we're tackling a deeply fascinating and, let's be totally honest, a deeply frustrating topic. People who completely refuse to apologize. We all know that one person, right? The one who would literally rather walk barefoot over hot coals than simply admit they forgot to send an email or made a bad call. Well, today we're going way beyond the surface level of this behavior. We aren't just talking about simple stubbornness here. We're embarking on an exploration of psychological self-preservation. By the end of this explainer, you're going to understand exactly what's happening inside the brain of someone who absolutely refuses to say those two simple words, "I'm sorry."
So have you ever been in an argument with someone who was clearly in the wrong, but no matter what evidence you presented to them, they simply refuse to say sorry? I know you have. We all have. And it's incredibly maddening, isn't it? You lay out the facts, the timeline of events is totally undeniable, you approach them calmly, and yet they just won't take ownership of their actions. It makes you question your own sanity for a second. But what if I told you that brick wall you're hitting is actually a highly complex, brilliantly designed psychological fortress? When you confront this behavior, you usually hit a massive wall of surface-level deflection. They'll abruptly change the subject, downplay the issue like you're making a mountain out of a molehill, or, and this is the absolute classic, turn the entire situation around to somehow blame you for being upset in the first place. Sound familiar? Now, while it's deeply frustrating to be on the receiving end of this, psychology reveals something fascinating. These aren't just stubborn quirks or a bad attitude designed to annoy you. These deflection tactics are deeply ingrained defensive patterns. Their mind is literally using these strategies to survive what it perceives as intense emotional discomfort. They are in pure survival mode, desperately trying to keep a perceived threat at bay.
Which brings us to Section 1, the fragile ego.
To really understand why this happens, think about what an apology actually requires from a person. It requires them to admit they made an error. For most of us, making a mistake naturally feels a bit embarrassing. It stings, it might temporarily hurt our confidence, but you know what? We get over it. We learn from it, we apologize, and we move on with our day. But for those who never apologize, that temporary sting doesn't exist. Instead, admitting a mistake is treated by their brain as a major, catastrophic threat to their entire self-image. This is what we call ego protection. It's the brain's reliance on hidden internal mechanisms to defend a fragile self-image against the embarrassment and threat of admitting a mistake at all costs. Their brain is actively, fiercely projecting a fragile ego. It's throwing up heavy shields because it genuinely feels under attack.
Let's look at how they do this in Section 2, 5 defense mechanisms.
We're going to systematically break down the hidden psychological reasons, the actual anatomy of a non-apologizer. We're talking about blame avoidance, identity confusion, their public mask, hidden shame, and seeking comfort over growth. Each one of these acts as a protective barrier around their ego. Each one is a highly specific tool their brain uses to avoid the incredibly painful reality of saying, "I'm sorry." And honestly, understanding these layers completely changes how you view conflicts with these individuals.
The very first line of defense is constant responsibility avoidance. When things go wrong, emotionally immature people completely refuse to look inward. They have a go-to list of external targets ready to take the fall. It was just bad luck. It was their boss's unrealistic expectations. It was their partner distracting them. It was the traffic. Honestly, it's amazing they don't just blame the alignment of the stars or Mercury being in retrograde rather than their own poor planning. Psychologically, accepting responsibility would force them to confront uncomfortable truths about their own flaws. Because their mind prioritizes protecting their ego over accepting reality, they instantly shift the blame to these external targets to completely escape that internal conflict. It's an absolute reflex for them.
And this highlights a stark contrast in how failures are internalized, which is the core of our second mechanism, identity confusion. An emotionally mature person can separate constructive feedback from their core identity. They think, "I made a mistake." It's an isolated action, completely separate from who they are as a human being. But emotionally immature people, the ones who simply cannot apologize, attach their failures directly to their identity. Their internal monologue doesn't say, "I made a mistake." It says, "I am a mistake." Because their self-esteem relies entirely on projecting a flawless ego, they just can't separate their behavior from their identity. That means even a tiny, helpful piece of constructive criticism feels like a devastating, catastrophic personal attack. Apologizing would mean admitting they're inherently flawed, and their fragile self-image simply cannot survive that conclusion.
Now, to prevent these deep vulnerabilities from being exposed, they literally edit reality to protect their public social mask. Admitting an error threatens their self-image because honest answers often involve facing guilt, rejection, or emotional failure. So, they go to work rewriting the script. First, they simplify the situation to remove all the messy nuance where they might actually be at fault. Then, they intentionally omit crucial details that might directly implicate them. Finally, they shift the blame entirely onto someone else's shoulders. This silent, ongoing manipulation allows them to maintain that perfect public mask. By keeping conversations totally surface level and actively skipping over the inconvenient facts, they retain total control over what you actually know about them. It's a highly calculated defense mechanism designed to keep you at arm's length.
You see, for these individuals, an apology is a dangerous doorway to feelings they have spent years trying to suppress. This is where we really have to step back and find a little bit of empathy. These individuals often carry deeply hidden regret and intense shame. We all have moments we wish we could undo, things we aren't proud of, but for some minds, regret becomes an anchor deeply tied to their identity. They replay bad decisions with incredible intensity in the dark. To avoid the overwhelming, crushing weight of future disappointment, shame, or feeling deeply inadequate, they hide their most painful mistakes from the world, and quite often, even from themselves. Processing that heavy regret is just too overwhelming. So an apology isn't just a polite social convention for them, it's opening a floodgate to painful, suppressed emotions they are absolutely desperate to keep shut.
Ultimately, all of these defenses culminate in one foundational choice: choosing comfort over growth. Real personal growth requires vulnerability. It's repetitive, it's incredibly slow, and it is almost always emotionally uncomfortable. But an emotionally immature person's nervous system actually treats emotional risk and vulnerability as literal physical danger. They use avoidance to keep themselves feeling safe in the immediate moment. They would much rather run away from a conflict, ignore an issue entirely, or let a once great relationship completely stagnate than face the temporary friction and emotional discomfort required to make a genuine apology. They are going to choose immediate, stagnant comfort over the hard work of long-term growth every single time.
And that brings us to Section 3, Path to Absolute Accountability.
We've peeled back the layers of this psychological fortress together. We've seen exactly how blame avoidance, identity confusion, public masks, hidden shame, and the desperate need for immediate comfort all trap these individuals in a relentless cycle. It truly is a tragedy. They want the freedom, the trust, and the depth of adult connections, but they absolutely refuse to take on the accountability that's required to sustain those connections. It really comes down to a choice between emotional defense and true adulthood. Letting your ego make excuses and constantly avoiding responsibility keeps you trapped. True adulthood and healthy, lasting relationships only truly begin when we make the conscious, brave choice to stop avoiding responsibility. We have to start taking absolute ownership of our actions, even when, and especially when, it's emotionally uncomfortable. That is where real freedom is found.
So I have to ask, will you start noticing the hidden psychological patterns that most people completely overlook? The next time someone absolutely refuses to apologize to you, you now know it isn't just them being difficult or stubborn. You are witnessing a fragile ego fighting for its absolute survival. If you love diving deep into the hidden psychology that drives everyday human behavior, make sure you subscribe to this explainer. Because once you start understanding these fascinating, small patterns that shape our minds, you'll see the world and the people around you in a completely different way. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today, and keep learning.